full house this afternoon, so welcome everybody, and a particular welcome to our guests. It seems hardly any time at all since we had the last one of these. But seriously, at RUSI, at times of elections, we are particularly vigilant in making it clear that we're entirely neutral. We're a non-partisan institute, and that is reflected in everything we do during this period. But as an institute, we're not neutral on the importance of defence to our country, defence and security to our country. And that's one of the reasons it's so important for us to provide a forum of this sort. And we're not neutral on the need to raise the quality of the defence and security country here in this country, the debate in this country, because that's actually central to our charitable mission, has been for almost 190 years. And finally, we're not neutral on the value and importance of democracy to this country. Our democracy, I think, in many ways is under more challenge internally, but also externally than it's been for some time. And some of the countries who wish us harm seek to undermine our democracy and that of our allies. So it's even more important that as a country we do everything we can, particularly at a time of elections, to make sure our democracy is strengthened by the process and not weakened. And I certainly personally like to pay tribute to all the candidates from all the parties who are brave enough to put themselves forward for election. Sometimes we too readily in a democracy spend all our time criticising the politicians without actually also saluting them for their willingness to put themselves forward in a process which is not always easy and quite rightly is rigorous and critical. For your information, we did ask a representative of the Scottish National Party to take part in this event. Understandably, they were unable to travel from Scotland for this event, but we did ask them in case anybody wished to know. I'm not going to comment any further on that. And finally, it does give me great pleasure to welcome Lucy Smith, who's going to chair this. Fisher. One more. Lucy Fisher, who's going to chair this event for us. And I think one of the most important elements of our democracy in relation to defence is actually to have specialist correspondents who take the time to develop a degree of expertise in our area, which can sometimes be quite complex, so that it's well understood and explained to the public at a time when there are so many other issues on their agenda. So, Lucy, thank you very much for your service in that, and thank you for taking on this task. Please.
Well, good afternoon. I'm Lucy Fisher, the Defence Editor at The Times, and this is the main and only defence debate of this general election campaign. We're just a fortnight away from the polls now, and this seems a timely moment to focus minds, given that NATO leaders are, of course, arriving in the UK next week. We're entering a pivotal period for defence as we pitch towards a strategic defence and security review in 2020, which will set the plan for the next 5 years. And of course, grave questions hang over defence budgets, the state of our current ground forces, and the military's ability to modernise in the face of emerging threats and technology. In the next Parliament, the government of the day will also have to grapple with historical allegations against veterans, engage in a debate about personnel, pay and conditions, maybe review some arms export control policies, and of course develop strategies for the space and cyber domains. Now, this national picture of defence is set against a backdrop of increasing state competition on the world stage and increasingly a very unpredictable behaviour of even our closest allies. So there's a lot to discuss today, and I'm delighted we're joined by this distinguished panel who will be setting out their party stalls and then taking questions from the floor. Before I introduce them, 2 quick notes, please. In the event of an emergency, RUSI staff will direct everyone to the relevant exits. And secondly, I just want to clarify the attribution of this event. Unusually for RUSI, it is all on record and on camera. That is not just the presentations that our panelists will make, but also the questions and answers. So, to the panel, who I know will be familiar to you, we're joined by Ben Wallace, the Conservative Defence Secretary, who's been in post for 4 months and has already secured a £2.2 billion increase for defence in the September spending round. A former MSP in Holyrood, he first entered Westminster in 2005 and has the distinction of being the longest-serving security minister. Of course, Ben is a military man. As an officer in the Scots Guards, he served in Northern Ireland, Germany, Cyprus and Central America, and he's worked for the defence company Kinetic. Nia Griffith is Labour's Shadow Defence Secretary. She was first elected to the Commons in 2005 and is a graduate of the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme. Nia was previously a ministerial aide at the Department for the Environment, where she worked on climate and flooding bills when Labour was last in government. And she has presided over Labour's defence brief for the past 3 years. Finally, Baroness Smith of Newnham is the Liberal Democrats' defence spokesperson in the House of Lords. An academic and previously a fellow at Chatham House, Julie, as I understand we're allowed to call you. Julie's research focuses on the history and politics of the EU. Julie's also been on the Armed Forces Parliamentary Scheme and is the Secretary of the Lords Defence Group. So I will give each of our speakers 5 minutes to set out their stall, and we've decided to do this in alphabetical order. So Nia, I'll start with you, please.
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be here at RUSI and to be talking about defence, because for Labour, the security and defence of this country is of paramount importance. It's our top priority. Now, in this audience, you know better than most the very diverse range of threats that we face and the absolute need to have very strong defences to combat them. Strong conventional forces, strong cyber tactics, and, of course, our nuclear deterrent. And so many of the security challenges that we face do not respect conventional geographical borders, whether that's the disinformation and hybrid attacks from Russia, whether it is trying to eradicate the poisonous ideology of Daesh, or whether it is in the real need for us now to tackle the existential threat of the climate crisis. And that's why Labour believes so very, very firmly in working through our alliances. We are absolutely committed to NATO. We want to see the UK play a strong role in the United Nations and other forums. And as we say in the Labour Party, we understand that by the strength of our common endeavour, we can achieve so much more than we could do alone. And so if we were privileged to be elected in a fortnight's time, our first priority would be to have a full strategic defence and security review, to be as up-to-date as possible with the threats facing this country, and to determine the priorities for our defence and security, including, of course, the greater impact of climate change on our security in the future. And we will continue to invest in our world-class defence industry. We are committed to spending 3% of GDP on research and development. And unlike the Tories, we will buy British wherever we possibly can. And we are committed in our manifesto to buying the ships for the RFA, the Fleet Solid Support ships in Britain from our UK shipyards. But our kit is of no value whatsoever without the dedicated men and women who run our armed forces, and defence are absolutely at the heart of our defence. Now, since the RUSI debate on the election of 2017, we have seen 4 Secretaries of State, and not one of them, and with all due respect to Ben, who hasn't yet had time, has actually got to grips with the crisis in recruitment and retention that we have seen in our armed forces, a problem that has emerged since the Tories took over in 2010. Now, there's been a lot of backslapping in recent months about some improvement in recruitment figures, but the figures speak for themselves. The size of every service has fallen every year since the Tories have been in office. And so the fully trained size of the army is now at a mere 73,000, 10% below strength, and that's a drop in 1,000 just since July. And House of Commons figures show that if this continues at this rate, we will be down to just 65,000 by the end of another parliamentary term. And the failure of dealing with this issue makes me wonder, is it that it is just incompetence? Or is it that there is some hidden agenda by Tory ministers not to actually want to maintain the size of our armed forces? So Labour will scrap the Capita contract, which has been an unmitigated disaster. And we will radically overhaul the other contracts that are not working for our armed forces and for our taxpayers. We would not, for example, be privatising the Veterans Service, but instead insisting on better support for those who have served our country so well. And let me say in closing that I know from working with Jeremy Corbyn that he is absolutely committed to the defence and security of this country, and that the next Labour government will do whatever it takes to keep the UK and its people safe. Thank you.
Thank you. Julie.
Thank you. I note the way we're seated, I was set to face the clock, so I've turned around slightly in the hope that you can see me and hear me. Normally I would stand up to speak, but we were told we were sitting down, so I apologise for that and hope that I can be heard. As you will have realised, I am not the Liberal Democrats' #1 defence spokesperson, that is Jamie Stone. There seems to be an issue about parliamentary candidates based in Scotland managing to make it down to London. As far as I know, the trains do still run from north to south. But anyway, Jamie isn't able to be here. And so I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I wasn't part, therefore, of the 2017 hustings. The last time I was in a hustings in RUSI was actually at the time of the referendum, where I did a hustings with the British Deaf Association. And all of my words had to be changed into British Sign Language. So this means that today I can at least speak slightly more quickly and hopefully get across a message that is one of Liberal Democrat commitment to defence. But we were asked by Lucy before we came down to try and ensure we had a debate. And I think in our opening remarks, one of the things that will become obvious is that all three of the party representatives are going to be saying, we are committed to defence, that defence is the first duty of the state, and Liberal Democrats, like the Labour Party, are committed to that. We're also committed to NATO and to our 2% defence commitment. There is a slight danger that I'm going to replicate many of the things that Nia has just said. But I think my focus will be more on one of the key aspects of Liberal Democrat policy. It may not surprise you that obviously one of our key commitments is staying in the European Union. So although I want to talk about NATO, those European links remain crucial. But I think we're not necessarily going to go quite down the same line of getting rid of defence contracts necessarily, but I do want to talk a bit about defence procurement. But the Liberal Democrats have long been a party committed to the international rule-based order. We think foreign and security policy are crucial, and that defence of the realm, while vital and where we must devote finance, nevertheless, military capabilities should come at the end of a process. We need to defend ourselves, but we also need to focus on diplomacy and multilateral alliance building alongside having clear defence commitments. And in that regard, we were and remain deeply committed to multilateralism. NATO is clearly going to be our most important multilateral environment if the UK leaves the European Union. So NATO is important, but our relations with our European partners are also vitally important. At a time when the American president can't be relied upon, then it becomes even more important that the United Kingdom builds on its relationships on a bilateral and a multilateral basis with our European partners, strengthening the Franco-British relationship, working with the Dutch, but ideally staying within the European Union. And if we don't, finding ways of ensuring that we're still as closely linked as possible to PESCO. Because if we leave the European Union, our security challenges don't decline. They remain at least as strong. And indeed, if the European Union is weakened by British departure, one of the few people that will actually benefit is likely to be Vladimir Putin and his foreign policy. So I think it's vitally important that the UK maintains and strengthens our multilateral links. We are committed to serious defence expenditure, to the 2%, where we believe our Remain bonus is actually going to ensure that more money can be spent on defence than under a Tory Brexit scenario. But that money needs to be spent appropriately. We need to secure the right conditions for our servicemen and women and for veterans. But in addition, we need to make sure that defence procurement is done correctly. The letting of the contracts needs to be looked at, and we need to think about multi-annual planning that goes beyond 5-year SDRs to working perhaps even on a cross-party basis on some areas of defence policy where all the main parties would say we should be making commitments so that we can get away from a 5-year electoral cycle or, as it's become recently, a 2.5-year electoral cycle.
Thank you. Ben.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and thank you to RUSI for inviting us here today. This election is about a choice, about do you believe the defence of the nation is best in the hands of the Conservative Party and Boris Johnson or in the hands of Jeremy Corbyn? I'm not going to sit here and go through the Labour Party manifesto. I'm sure the Nia can do that for herself. But I am going to say to anyone watching or listening to this, if you want to ask yourself who is best to lead our defence, look at the voting actions, the actions of Jeremy Corbyn, the statements in the past, and his attitude towards our enemies and his attitude towards our defence budget and our security services and all the other people that is there day in, day out to keep us safe. But not only is there a choice about who is going to be in charge, there's also a challenge about what we want from our armed forces, what we want our armed forces to do. It's going to be a challenge about what reforms need to happen in today's 21st century to meet the growing threats from hybrid, cyber and space. And also the challenge of how we value the men and women serving in our armed forces today, and also those men and women who served yesterday in those armed forces, and how we as a society value them, recruit them, retain them, and treat them afterwards. And he is right. Yes, I've the fourth Defence Secretary, I think. I've learnt that being a Defence Secretary is a bit like, if you remember Roy Castle and the Record Breakers, there was always the man who came every year to spin the plates, and whether or not he would manage to keep enough up in the air to break the record. Being a Defence Secretary, I think, is very much like that. You are constantly spinning equipment programmes, Treasury, number 10 demands, and indeed political demands. So the first part of that challenge is to get the money. So yes, we are committed to spend as a minimum in the Conservative Party 2% of GDP, but it's also why at the last spending review I fought and got 2.6% real-term increase in our defence budget, way above the 0.5% of £2.2 billion, to make sure that not only could the armed forces stand still, but they could continue to meet their ambitions and their equipment programme that they had committed to in the SDSR 15. It's also why it's really important, I view, that going forward in the defence, we get that balance right. The balance between new equipment, British-made, international consortium-made, gold-plated or equipment that is fit for purpose. The people, the most important equipment of our armed forces, the men and women in it, and how much we spend on them and their terms and conditions. And also our ambitions around the world, getting that balance right. Every day as Defence Secretary you are asked, you know, can you commit to this? Can you send a ship there, or can you send a battle group to somewhere else? Of course, every Defence Secretary will have to make those decisions, no matter how much money they have or how big their armed forces are. But what is important is that the Conservative government recognises that for a defence policy to be valid, it has to be sustainable. We have to have a budget that's sustainable. We have to have an ambition, an appetite that matches our stomachs, and that is what we are determined to do. And that our manifesto reflects those three challenges between equipment, the people, and indeed what we want to be and do in the world. So that's why we can invest in new equipment. And I was delighted in November to finalise the purchase of 5 Type 31s, British-made in Rosyth, as a next generation of frigates. And indeed to procure £2.8 billion worth of Boxer armoured vehicles for the army, finally putting to bed the whole tracer saga. I remember I was an armoured infantry platoon commander back in the early 90s. I have been through tracer, trials of truth, MEV, FRES, whatever the thing's called, finally managing to put that to bed and deliver to the army what it deserves, which is a next generation of mechanised vehicle, which will be made in Britain, made in Telford and Stockport. But yes, a German consortium design, but made in Britain. And that's actually how you do defence procurement. You recognise you have to work together. You can't single-handedly, unilaterally create modern 21st century warfighting equipment if you bury your head in your sand and simply only prescribe to yourself what you want to do. And that's why, recognising that people are the best equipment of all, it's a different armed forces from when I was in. Men and women both working, often the woman earning more than the husband, often both in the services. So we're going to offer free wraparound childcare for men and women in the armed services. We've extended right to buy, so people in the armed forces can indeed buy their own home. And that is tremendous success. Because that is how we're going to deal with some of these recruitment and retention issues, is by valuing them and reflecting what's on offer in the outside world. And for those people who used to serve, continue to recognise our veterans, the establishment of the Office of Veterans Affairs. I've got other departments to chip in. So the Department for Transport is going to pay for the Veterans Rail Card. And that we're also going to make sure we take further steps to protect our veterans for vexatious claims. The challenge will be what we do with our armed forces. The challenge will be making the case to the Treasury and a Prime Minister about how important defence is. And so I would leave you with that. When I go at the next spending round, make my case to the Prime Minister. My Prime Minister will be Boris Johnson, who did see the value last spending round and gave me £2.2 billion. I can't say the same for Jeremy Corbyn when it comes to making the tough decisions between what's important to him and what's important to our armed forces.
Thank you. Well, there's lots to pick up on there in terms of the Conservative government's record in recruitment and retention, Jeremy Corbyn's past record in voting on defence and security issues, procurement policy, so I will leave that to the floor. I'd just like to use my prerogative as chair to ask a few questions. And to start with, I want to focus on NATO, which a couple of you mentioned. President Macron's pretty explosive remarks about the alliance, casting doubt over Article 5, have sparked a furious debate all across Europe. But there's been a real lack of public discourse around that in the UK, and perhaps that's understandable in one sense because we've had the election campaign. But I want to put it to each of you the question, with President Macron's intervention and the behaviour of President Trump and President Erdogan, is NATO in crisis? And is the French president correct that NATO is suffering from brain death? Ben Wallace.
No, it's not correct. And in fact, I was at the NATO defence ministers meeting in Brussels about 3 weeks ago, or 2 weeks ago. At that time, we were focused on America and Turkey issues. I had plenty of meetings with the French and everyone else. No, it's not in crisis. Let's remember the cheapest defence we have of all is solidarity. That is the strength of our NATO alliance, is that we are together on Article 5, on other areas that we seek to see off the threat we face. Yes, of course it's important that NATO is always asking itself, what can we do? How can we adapt to the modern threat? How can we adapt to Russia's threat, specifically in the world of hybrid and cyber? But it isn't brain dead at all. And in fact, I think NATO has a real future. And I think hopefully next week you will see that agenda decided going forward, which will be around the acceptance of NATO looking at hybrid, cyber issues. And indeed, we are seeing more countries committing towards 2% than there were 10 years ago. That's a good news story. It's not as many as we'd like, but only yesterday Angela Merkel committed to Germany making a 2% a commitment towards spending GDP. So it's a long way from being brain dead. And let's not forget, and this is the challenge, and one benefit of being the security minister previously, I know exactly what the threat is and where it comes from, is we have to communicate to the public there is a real threat out there. It may not come in the same guise of a crude iron curtain that used to sit there, we could all go and take journalists, take photographs of the Berlin Wall, but there is a real threat out there. There's a real threat of international terrorism. There's a real threat of state-sponsored cybercrime and state-sponsored espionage and sabotage and assassinations going on. We only have to remember what happened in Salisbury. And there is a real threat of a Russia, for example, towards NATO that bit by bit, chip by chip, tests our resolve. Uses Ukraine to do that partly, uses hybrid warfare on our Nordic flanks to do that. And that means the message is there is a threat. The public need to understand that threat. We need to communicate that better. But the way to resolve that is through international collaboration. NATO, Five Eyes, where appropriate with European Union, where appropriate with an ad hoc, but we have to get to grips with that together. And then when we do that, we push back Russia and that threat, as we saw, expelling 153 diplomats after the Salisbury. That woke Russia up. They won't do that again.
Can I just follow up quickly to ask you about this German-led idea for a commission, perhaps a panel of elders, to sort of take a pause perhaps and think about NATO going forward? What do you make of that proposal?
I think it's a good idea that we examine. I mean, it's the 21st century. You know, hybrid warfare is way up there. You know, Gerasimov, the Russian chief of the General Staff, had made numerous views of his doctrines over the last few years. And I think NATO needs to think about that and reflect how it's going to do business. To be fair, most of the military committee have already been thinking about that. I think it's time for the politics to catch up with the military.
Julie Smith, same questions to you.
So I think the starting question was about, is NATO in crisis? And I think Ben is possibly a little bit too complacent, because we for decades assumed that in many ways our closest ally within NATO was the United States. The assumption was we shared the same values, and the assumption was if push came to shove, the United States would always be in Europe to bail us out. It worked through the Cold War. It wasn't supposed to work after the Cold War, but ultimately, up to and including Obama, we essentially assumed that our values were the same. I think with Donald Trump as president, we are seeing a very different sort of United States. If a Democrat replaces him next year, perhaps things will revert to business as normal, but that's not necessarily the case. And if Donald Trump is re-elected, there are serious questions about the American commitment to NATO. And if we don't have firm American commitments, then NATO is going to be much weakened. But even assuming that the US fundamentally stays on board and recognises shared interests and shared values with the European members of NATO, we have to ask what's going on in Turkey. We have to think about the balance of our fellow NATO members and whether there isn't indeed some fragmentation. So I completely agree with Ben that solidarity is vitally important, but we need to ensure that the solidarity is there. And we need, as members of NATO, to work out how we work together, particularly when one or more member states begin perhaps to look to Russia. If you're purchasing your equipment from Russia, what does that say about your interests? If you are engaging in activities in Syria against people we are fighting alongside, that raises, again, questions about Turkey. So I think there are some issues about NATO, not necessarily in terminal crisis, but some problems. And Commission about the future, well, yes, that it clearly, NATO, like any other organisation, I was going to say any organisation that gets to 70, but if you were a human being, you might be being retired by 70. So if we're looking at the next 70 years of NATO, thinking about how that works in the 21st century against 21st century threats is clearly a very sensible thing to do.
Nia Griffith.
Well, thank you very much indeed for the question. Well, absolutely, NATO is alive and well, isn't it? Extremely important to us. Ben has just outlined the threats, and certainly when I have been out in NATO recently at headquarters, it is very much about how we adapt to meet those threats. How do we deal with things like information warfare? And it's absolutely right that across the European part of NATO, we should take our responsibilities very, very seriously. That has always been the case in Eastern Europe, but perhaps there has been some complacency creeping in parts of Western Europe. And it's absolutely vital that we do get on the front foot and that we do deal with the many different types of threats. You can see in the attitude of countries like Sweden and Finland that see increasingly the relationship with NATO is very important to them, how much we do need to work together as a team within NATO and with our allies just outside NATO. So it is very much the case that we need to reflect in the political reality what actually the experts on the ground are looking at and are telling us, and to make sure that our defences are fit for the 21st century, and that we are very much part of a NATO team, because we certainly cannot go it alone.
And just finally on the idea of a commission to kind of consider what we should be doing going forward.
Well, absolutely. The idea that we need to be constantly renewing and constantly looking at updating and taking that forward through a commission, certainly. But it is very much about, as well, us making the case within our own individual countries across the NATO family for the need for the continued commitment at that political level to NATO.
And secondly, I'd just like to ask the panel, the threat analysis can often be boiled down, we often talk about in defence circles, to Russia today, China tomorrow. I wanted to ask you, how much of a threat is China already today, and what should the next UK government be doing to handle China? Julie.
I think the interesting thing about China is, regardless of its military capabilities, it has got huge global reach through a whole range of economic activities that have very much gone under the radar. But if we look at the number of ports where China has maybe given loans that have then been called in, we're seeing China engaged much more across the world, including owning parts of British infrastructure as well. So I think in terms of Chinese engagement in the world, then it's clearly very important. I think the shorter term issue for the United Kingdom is to consider what's happening in Hong Kong and how we respond to that. Because at the moment, China is flouting the Sino-British agreement over Hong Kong and seems to say that doesn't matter. So I think we have a shorter term issue that we need to discuss with the Chinese. In the longer term, there are areas where perhaps we could collaborate, but we need to understand what Chinese interests are and work out the extent to which we're willing to trade and engage with China versus how we look at their human rights record, which is clearly something that as Liberal Democrats would be concerned about.
Thank you. Nia, Griffith.
Yeah, I think China poses a huge threat to us because we are unused to dealing with the Chinese psychology. A state which does not have elections, therefore can plan much more long term than perhaps we would do. A state which has no regard for human rights. And it has been, little by little, step by step, creeping up behind us, as Julie's just indicated, in terms of the economic drive by China. And we must call them out, whether that is by protecting international trade routes on the high seas in accordance with international law, or whether it is by speaking directly on issues of human rights. We absolutely cannot stand by. We haven't worked out how we deal with China yet. We need to, and we need to urgently. And in the instance of Hong Kong, absolutely, we should be taking a much greater lead there and a much firmer stance on the rights of the people of Hong Kong to their democratic institutions and their democratic rights. So it is something that we, as I say, we've got a real challenge ahead, and we have to work out how we're going to deal with it.
Wallace.
I think China is undoubtedly a threat in our intelligence and security world, where it prosecutes huge levels of espionage and cyber attacks on us, as well as intellectual property theft and other areas. In other spaces, it's a challenge to all of us in the West. It's not just to the United Kingdom or the United States or Europe. It's a challenge because it is challenging all our international rules-based system, all our established norms about how we do business, about our acceptance of human rights, our acceptance of different government structures, and how it works. And it's a real challenge that the whole of the West, I sense, hasn't really got its head round. And so to be able to sit here and say, oh, I've got the solution, I think I'd just be misleading you. I don't think we have a clear, easy solution. I think we have lots of questions to ask about how we in Europe engage with China, yet when we see them engaging in other parts of the world, we think it's a threat. I always use the example that we call China using debt diplomacy around the world, but when it comes to Europe, we call it inward investment. And I think we have to really have a proper, robust, grown-up conversation about where the West's values fit and how it's going to assert those values. We're British. We believe in fair play. Well, that's how I start this process. And when people say, look, there's evidence of Chinese espionage or intellectual property theft in the United States or in Europe, I say, okay, if you want access to our markets and our consumers, if you want access to our university institutions in order to collaborate, because then of course there are rules that you play by. You don't steal, you don't copy, you enforce patents, etc. And that is something I think our British values are all about, asserting ourselves about fair play. And then if you are prepared to sign up to the international norm and those rules, then yes, you are treated in the same way another country would be treated. But at the moment, there is a threat, both in security space and also in the economic sector. Jaguar Land Rover, I think a few years ago, suffered a very major drop in sales to China. Well, one of the reasons was that, not just the Chinese slowdown. If you go to China, you'll see an awful lot of very, very similar cars that look remarkably like Jaguar Land Rovers driving around. There is a consequence for that type of intellectual property theft or economic exploitation, and that hurts British, normal, everyday, ordinary voters in the same way, potentially other types of threats. So I think the challenge is thrown to the West. We need to collectively think about how we're going to do that, and that cannot be boiled up in a couple of weeks or in a couple of sentences, but we are going to have to deal with it sooner rather than later.
Thank you. Now I'm going to open the floor to questions. Could you please state your name and, if you wish, an affiliation, and could you wait for the microphone? So, yes. Larissa Brown. Is there a microphone? Yeah. Thank you.
Larissa Brown from the Daily Mail. I'm just wondering, does the panel think there should be more transparency when it comes to deploying special forces abroad? And Nia, would you be happy to give the go-ahead for special forces to kill terrorists wearing suicide vests? And then just one other quick one. Comments on Afghan interpreters. Should more Afghans be allowed into Britain as promised by Gavin Williamson? Thank you.
Nia, why don't we go to you first?
Right, but if I may start first of all on our special forces, there is, I think, a very strong case for greater transparency of what our special forces are doing to keep us safe. Now, it is absolutely vital, obviously, that no operational detail is inadvertently put out there, and that the majority of any form of scrutiny would be post the action, and it would need to be a committee such as, for example, the Intelligence and Security Committee, and Dominic Grieve himself as chair of that committee has said this could be an appropriate role for the committee, where the members are security cleared and where obviously the utmost respect is given to the security of the nation. So it is something that certainly happens in other countries that are our allies. There is a case for it, and I think it could be done in a very responsible way that would allow that additional scrutiny and would allow sensible dialogue about the role of our special forces. In terms of whether there is a case for killing those who lead heinous terrorist organisations, I think everybody here is very well aware of international law and very well aware that the ideal is to bring those people to justice and to make them face the trial and the consequences for their actions. But quite clearly, when we are dealing with people who wear suicide vests and who put themselves and others in immediate danger, then we have to do what it takes, and there is a case. For eliminating those individuals. In terms of the Afghan interpreters, this, I believe, is a very serious issue. We have asked people to put themselves at risk, themselves and their families at risk, in order to serve us. And if we hope to do that in the future, out of pure self-interest, never mind the moral and humanitarian obligation we have to these individuals, then we must guarantee their safety. And for many of them, returning to their communities is simply not an option. And so we absolutely must make sure that they have the very best of opportunities. And it grieves me quite to see somebody who has actually done the job out there for us, then being turned down by some paperwork trail here as not having the security clearance to work with our armed forces in another role here. And we have actually seen cases like that. And it's absolutely vital that we do recognise the service they've given and make sure that they do have the opportunities to continue to work with us and to serve with us. And certainly going forward, if we intend to engage interpreters anywhere else in the future, our track record will be of extreme importance.
Ben.
Right, so the good news, on the Afghan front, I looked at the pledge that Gavin Williamson had made to the Daily Mail about it, and I think you're right, it hasn't turned out as, I think, pledged. I think that's mainly to do with, my understanding is the criteria between people that had left before they applied and people that were made redundant affected by the British Armed Forces. So I've asked to look at that again to make sure we can fix that problem so that we get back the interpreters that I think we owe a debt of honour to and gratitude to. So we will see about the exact numbers, but I think it was it shouldn't have ended up as it did, I think is what I would say. On Special Forces, look, first of all, a large proportion of what they do, they are the executive arm of other parts of government, sending them on tasks. And those tasks are oversighted by the Intelligence and Security Committee already. Ministers actually are charged to oversight. That is their democratic obligation. I am charged by Parliament, and Parliament holds me to account. The operations that we send, sort of strategic operations, strategic commitments to countries, and, for example, the fight against ISIS in Syria and Iraq is an operation approved by Parliament and indeed oversighted that way. So I don't believe we should then go further and do greater oversight of our special forces. I'm afraid to disappoint you, Larissa. I think that the special forces wouldn't be special, actually, partly, if we did too much of that oversight. They are oversighted, they are checked, they act within accordance with international law wherever they act. They are advised by our lawyers, and we make sure that everything they do is in accordance with both approved government policy, NSC policy, and indeed, it's not just me that oversights them, so the wider part of government is engaged in many of seeing those operations. And so I don't think the time is necessary or right to do it. And as far as using lethal force against our threats, look, none of us should gloat in the use of killing anyone, but in the end, we have to do what is necessary in this country to keep us safe. We train our professionals in the armed forces to be the very best at what they do, and I can assure you, Nia, that if they had a chance in some of these events to detain people, they will, but very often we are not left with the luxury of that opportunity, and very often time is also of the essence. In the day of the internet, the day of modern communications, we are often up against it, and simply the reality is very dangerous people, they engage in the type of terrorism that Mr. Baghdadi and his awful gang have engaged in, they can expect the full force of the law, and if not, that lethal force.
Thank you. Well, that third question I thought was only for Nia, but since Ben's answered it as well, then I think, yes, the answer would be there are times when lethal force has to be used. So I think we're probably going to get agreement on that. In terms of special forces, I tend to agree slightly more with Nia than with Ben. I think there could be slightly more transparency, but we would absolutely need to ensure that we weren't damaging operations. So it needs to be more ex post. But I think the idea of not having too much oversight, which I think is what Ben said, I'd be a little bit worried about saying we shouldn't have too much oversight, because we could say that about special forces, but then we could say that about other military activities, and then we could extend it to other aspects of government. So I think oversight is important. And on Afghan interpreters, great that Ben is looking at it again. I think one of the key things is we have a duty to the Afghan interpreters If Afghanistan had gone the way we might have hoped in 2003, and it was now a peaceful state where people could go back and live without any sense of reprisal, then maybe we wouldn't need to give Afghan interpreters the opportunity to be here. But actually, that's not how it's ended up, and we have a duty to them. But also, I think we need to work through how the MOD and the Foreign Office and the Home Office look at certain issues about people who come, whether they've been interpreters or are coming to the UK and seeking asylum for various reasons, because I think there has been a disconnect between the Home Office and what we know is happening in terms of defence and foreign policy.
Thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan Beale, BBC. First of all, a question for Ben Wallace. You know, you said this is an election, a choice between essentially the Tories and Jeremy Corbyn. But, you know, we look at your record for the last 10 years. You've cut the Navy, you cut the Air Force, you cut the Army. Now at its smallest ever, 73,000. You can't even fill it up to 82,000, which is meant to be. You've left the nation's defences exposed. You haven't had maritime patrol aircraft for the last 10 years. You're now addressing it. A RUSI report came out earlier this week saying that you've left the British Army outgunned, outranged, with ageing artillery, with 800 troops in Estonia in harm's way. You've promised repeatedly, and your successors, that you would end what you call vexatious claims, and you have not. So I just put it to you, what makes you think people should trust the Tories on defence? For Neil Griffiths, you know, you said there that there is a case for eliminating individuals if they pose a direct threat. That is not what your party leader has said. And then added to that, you're proposing to spend 35 billion on renewing Trident, yet your leader seems to think that is just a bargaining chip, not a deterrent for nuclear disarmament. In other words, he wouldn't use it. So is your leader essentially wrong when he talks both about, you know, trying to arrest people like al-Baghdadi who will not be arrested, and the way that he sees the use of the deterrent? Thank you.
Ben, can people trust the Conservatives?
Well, look, first of all, two things about what we've been through in the last 9 years. First of all, you know, you cannot avoid the deficit that we were left with, the massive black hole in that programme, the equipment programme that everyone knew about in 2010, and having to put that right. And austerity was not some political choice. I know the Labour Party like to say that, but you know, we were overspending in 2010 more than the defence budget, the police budget, and the education budget put together. That is how much we were overspending every year. That's how big that deficit was. 145 billion or 35 billion it was at the time, and we had to deal with that. And that has hit all of the departments. That's hit nearly everywhere. But despite that, the British Armed Forces did manage and have managed to continue to deploy on operations and have managed to keep us safe. So yes, there's been pressure. Yes, there are challenges. Yes, we are living with a range of problems, both, yes, under the coalition government and indeed under the Labour. The weight of the PFI contracts that we've inherited from Labour, for example, I wish I could rip up tomorrow. I mean, the scale of them and the weight of the money you spend every year on servicing the Gordon Brown magic PFI is extraordinary. But also, yes, we have the capita budget that I'm having to put right. And the good news is, on the capita budget, we are 88% on track for our recruitment target for this financial year, and it's December. We think by April we'll be on 99% of that tunnel coming in. So the recruiting is starting to pick up. The challenge, as I've said at the beginning, is on the retention, and that's why changing that balance slightly about where we put equipment, the £18 billion equipment and services budget into the people budget is so important. And you know, you might have missed it, Jonathan, but all the way through the last 9 years, we have been doing, or less than 9 years, but a number of years, the operations in Syria and Iraq, defeating and attacking, well, taking out Daesh. That has been a tremendous success in taking out significant numbers of terrorists that pose direct threat to the United Kingdom and Europe. We have done that with RAF assets, military assets. We've done a number of incidents. If you remember the strike on Syria for using chemical weapons, you know, all those things have been possible, I haven't had everything, nobody else ever has, that they would have liked to have used. And as we speak, the Prince of Wales, HMS Prince of Wales, who, by the way, we're not leasing to the Americans, Mickey Mouse or anyone else, right, is on its way to, hasn't been handed over yet to the customer, but has completed a very successful, actually, sea trials. And HMS Queen Elizabeth is out there in the Atlantic doing even more important workup. So I think you can trust us because also behind defence, behind Boris Johnson's, and this is the point I said about the choice, it's Boris Johnson or Jeremy Corbyn's station, the 2.2 billion increase, 2.65% real terms increase, behind that is a government that knows what side it's on when it comes to security. A government that recognises that the IRA, Hezbollah, Hamas do not share our values, are not on our side, and have spent many years killing our allies and indeed killing us. And that is the thing I find the hardest about Jeremy Corbyn, is I don't think he knows what side he's on, and he wants to be the Prime Minister to defend this country.
Nia.
Right, well, can I just say, absolutely, look, Jeremy Corbyn takes the defence and security of this country extremely seriously and will do whatever it takes to defend this country. Now, the point is, he is a very thoughtful leader who wants to see the full facts and wants to have the full information in any decision-making that he makes. And so he will take a very measured approach, and as would all experts in the field, indeed, a very measured approach to action and wanting to know what the consequences will be. But at the end of the day, if it is a threat to security, as I have said, and he has repeated on many occasions, he will do whatever it takes. And that is an absolute commitment in terms of...
Sorry, he has not said he would take out a terrorist if they posed a direct threat to the country. He's avoided the answer there. And he said nothing that you're suggesting on that front. But you're saying something different to him.
Well, I think what is also sometimes not recognised is, of course, that Jeremy Corbyn is not a pacifist, and he has also been willing to intervene and been willing to make interventions, and that is all related to the. Well, he voted for the action in East Timor, as you well know, and
Supported the armed struggle in Northern Ireland, but on the wrong side.
And the point is, as I say, he is very much committed to taking advice, to taking security advice, and to therefore then acting upon it. And so, as I say, he's very much committed to doing that. And I think the issue that you raise, I think you just have to accept that in the position of having the security of this country in his charge, and he will take that above all else as the most important factor in any decision making.
Can I just come back to you on what Jonathan mentioned about Trident, Jeremy Corbyn's prevarication about whether he would ever use it. Is it a credible deterrent if Jeremy Corbyn is Prime Minister?
The point is that no Prime Minister, with the exception of Theresa May, has ever made their position absolutely clear on this issue. The point about having the deterrent is that it is there, it is a threat. Our enemies know that we have it, they know that we could use it, they know that there could be circumstances where the threat to us was such that we would use it, and the point is that if you are ultimately responsible for that security, and as I say, Jeremy taking that position, if we were in that position of ultimate threat, then he would make a decision that would be for the security and defence of this country.
And he would not a committee.
That is not what he said. I'm afraid 2 years ago he said he would not ever press that button.
Can we get you a microphone if you want to speak?
Right, yeah, so I can speak quite loudly as I
Okay.
say that.
Admiral Lord West is speaking.
I would be much happier if Nia's finger was on the button, to be quite honest, because Nia is very sound on all of these things. But I'm afraid what Jeremy said was a huge shock. It was a huge shock to anyone. How can you have a deterrent when you're not certain that the person who's meant to be wielding that deterrent sees it as a deterrent? And it is not a deterrent if that person says, and he has said already, that he would not press that button. And I find that really, really difficult. I mean, your position, I think, is much sounder. As I say, I'd be much happier with you, the finger on the button. But I'm afraid that is what really worries me.
But I think the point is, as I said, that it is there as a deterrent, and that, faced with the particular circumstances, then clearly, if you are committed to the defence and security of the country, you do what is right for the defence and security of the country.
It's not a deterrent if nobody believes that Jeremy Corbyn would ever use it, because before Theresa May, it was always ambiguous, it was left open, so the deterrent effect was there because there was a sense that the Prime Minister might use it. With Jeremy Corbyn, the view would be he will never use it, and that does away with the deterrent effect.
But the point is that when you are faced with the ultimate defence and security of your country, then you may very well do things that perhaps you would not do in normal circumstances, and therefore it will remain as a deterrent.
Well, it's up for others to make up their minds hearing those answers. Since we're on the subject of Trident, Julie, obviously the Liberal Democrats have come under some criticism for proposing to decrease the number of Vanguard-class successor submarines to 3, which would mean we would no longer have a continuous at-sea deterrent and instead an unpredictable patrol period. What do you say to criticism of that position?
So we've had a policy, we've spent about 12 years looking at Trident renewal and whether the party would support it at all, and got to a point of renewal. At the time of the 2015 election, I think the policy was somewhat untenable because we had a policy of fewer boats, and I chaired the group, the defence group that had Trident renewal as part of its policy, and the view was fewer boats, which at the time probably meant 2. The current policy has been looked at again, and we've said 3 boats. I agree that I think the idea of not having continuous at-sea deterrence could raise some concerns. It was last looked at in 2017, at which point our policy says, well, actually, there are no imminent threats. I think in 2019, the international security situation is more difficult than it was then. And I would certainly, Defence Secretary be saying, well, actually, we need to look further at this. But clearly, in terms of procuring, if we start procuring 3 boats, moving to 4 boats is easier than saying we're not renewing at all. So we're on the right track, but do we need to go further? I think we need to think about the global situation, and at the moment, it wouldn't be one where I think we would be mothballing the nuclear warheads.
Sorry, I've got to come in again on that because Julie is quite clear. Julie was quite clear in that House that she actually believed in CASD. She was absolutely clear, which was different from the front bench. And quite clearly from what she's saying, she still believes in CASD.
Yep.
So the Liberal Democrat position is extremely dodgy. And trying to have 1 or 2 votes and sometimes...
No, 3.
Is a nonsense.
So the policy is 3 boats. The detailed policy, and I can send you a copy of it, the detailed policy is looking at taking a step down the nuclear ladder. However, it is also in the context of what are the international security concerns of the day. And at the moment, I don't think there's anything to say we should be stepping back from CASD at the moment because the international security situation isn't such that the threats leave us in that position.
Well, this is why these debates are useful to hear spokespeople who sometimes disagree with their party policy.
The manifesto you disagree with too.
Yes, it is a manifesto policy. No, we've had enough, thank you, on Trident. Right. I'll take a question from a RUSI member, please. Perhaps the chap here. No.
James Spencer, RUSI member. 20 years ago, the defence budget was purely for defence. 10 years ago, it was defence and operations. And about 5 years ago, suddenly we discovered that a chunk of strategic intelligence from GCHQ, MI6, etc., was included in the defence budget. Could the panel members please specify how much of 2% of GDP will go straight to CDS's hand and how much gets farmed out to other bits? For defence, not operations.
It's a good question ahead of the SDSR. Ben Wallace.
I think if you look at the total, if you look at the Treasury Red Book of last year, the total heading of defence actually said 50 billion, right? Because it folded in, more than the 41 billion that we've now got for the MOD budget. It folded in security and other issues. So 50 billion, I think, is the figure that is used in the Red Book. And yes, that includes more. But remember, within that, and I remember this from Security Minister time, in 2015 we increased counter-terrorism budget by 30%. And some of that counter-terrorism budget goes into the MOD. So there was an increase in the security side that had been mainly used, obviously, in the fight against IS, etc. The National Cyber Security Programme, that is not an MOD budget line, for example, I think it's 1.3 billion. A large chunk of that has come into the MOD and GCHQ to build capacity around a national cyber defence force, and indeed we're going to allocate from within our own budget £72 million next year to start growing that capability. So it hasn't been one way, just because security and defence have at some levels been sort of sharing the same bed space. It doesn't mean a diminishment of defence. And you know, this is where I have to say I take my experience from the last job, and I'm interested in Lord West, who did both jobs as well, as Navy and Security Minister, is, you know, security and defence is a long tail, right? It is an absolute long tail. It starts with counter-radicalisation and the PREVENT programme at one end, and it ends up all the way through at potentially taking military action in Iraq against ISIS terrorists or other parts around the world. I mean, it is the whole effort of this country's security and defence. It is time we realise it doesn't belong in silos. It does actually belong in a huge thread all the way through, from soft power to protecting our democracy, to anti-corruption, money laundering, all the way through to crunchy military, you know, battle groups on the edge of Estonia, where we currently are, making sure we send a strong deterrent message to Russia. And the one thing I can say, if we are to progress in this century where the threat is hybrid, we have to get off this, it's mine, it's not his, different defence security silos. It is the same place. I will, of course, protect my budget, but I will also be happy where I need to, in order to see off the threat, to work with other intelligence agencies, the Home Office, GCHQ, to make sure that we work together, bringing our money together to make sure we see that in a collective response.
Thank you, Nia.
Well, absolutely. As Ben has said, the whole issue of defence and security does pan over a number of different areas. I think the important thing is what is the absolute commitment by a party to the issue of defence and security. And I would say first and foremost that we in the Labour Party, as set out in our manifesto, are absolutely committed to at least 2% of GDP being spent on defence. In addition to that, the 0.5% above inflation increase year on year throughout the next Parliament. Furthermore, we are committed to proper pay rise for our armed forces, and that will be funded out of the money that we have in Treasury over and above the defence budget, which is put aside for restoring public sector pay by allowing a 5% average increase in public sector pay. And that, as I say, includes our armed forces, and the pay review bodies will decide the absolute detail. In addition, of course, we are committed to 3% of GDP being spent on research and development, and a chunk of that will clearly be on defence technologies, which are so very, very important in helping us to keep ahead of the game. We're absolutely committed to the importance of cyber and cyber security, and in that respect we have also said that we will have a minister with specific responsibility for cyber security, and so that again is a commitment which will be cross-departmental. So I think the point is that overall we're very, very much committed to the full range of defence expenditures and working across government to enhance our security.
So I think defence expenditure, defence economics and defence statistics are all somewhat vague concepts in some ways, because we can all talk about a 2% commitment, which is fine, but it doesn't say how large the economy is, and it doesn't say anything about what's actually in the 2% bracket. And I think defence expenditure is skewed across NATO precisely because of the things we're allowed to put in the 2%, including pensions. Should they be part of that? I would have thought not, that they ought to be something separate. But at the moment, there isn't a policy that says we'll take that out. So I think we need to think about defence in terms of, yes, there's a commitment. The size of the economy, we believe, would be larger if the UK remains in the European Union, and therefore our 2% is of a larger budget. So we would be expecting over the course of a parliament about 3 billion more to be spent on defence. Should things be taken by other departments, and I know there's sometimes a criticism of the relationship between the aid budget and the defence budget, the Liberal Democrats are very clear that we want to renew our commitments to both of those things. But clearly in areas like counter-terrorism and cyber, they do range across departments. So I would have thought we ought to be arguing within a government to persuade the Home Office and the Chancellor that funding from the Home Office should also be contributing to defence and security. So I would be hoping we could expand what goes on expenditure for defence and security collectively.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. James Hurst from BFBS Forces News. You've all highlighted your commitment to spend 2% of GDP on defence. But in terms of manifesto commitments, there appear to be no commitments on what that will actually be spent on. And specifically, when everybody says the people of the armed forces are the most important thing, can you give a commitment now to how many people will be in the army in 5 years' time when you're elected? Not how many you will aim to have, how many people will there be in the army at the end of your term of government?
Thank you. Nia.
Well, I think the important thing here is having a strategic defence and security review, that we absolutely need to have the most up-to-date information on the threats that we face, and we need to shape our defences for the future accordingly. But I think it's also important to just repeat what I've just said about the pay for our armed forces. I think that is an issue in retention, and it is something that I say we are funding separately from our defence budget because we recognise the need to do so.
Julie?
We have no plans to cut the numbers from what they're supposed to be now, and would be looking to recruit to ensure that we had the 82,000 soldiers that we're looking for. We would also be looking to improve skills shortages and so on, and have a golden handshake for STEM graduates and so on. So we will be looking to keep numbers the same as they are, to ensure that people are adequately skilled, and to look at ways of ensuring there's an educational benefit for people, and particularly making sure that servicemen and women can get their children into schools mid-year and so on. So there are a whole range of things to help families and individuals within the armed forces, and we hope that would assist with recruitment but also retention.
I can't guarantee it, because I can't guarantee what's going to happen in the next 5 years. I can tell you that I am determined to try and get us back to 82,000 with the army. That is why, as I said, in our manifesto, we're spending £165 million on wraparound childcare to try and address retention. It's why we did extend the right to buy to encourage people to commit further and longer into the armed forces. It's why I'm quite clear that when I, about a month or 2 months into starting, I sent each of the chiefs a letter with a single priority. 2 of those chiefs got a priority that simply said, I said to the Chief of General Staff, your priority is to fix your recruiting and retention. That is your number one. Don't come to me asking for lots of new kit, because there'll be no one to go in the back of them, right? So, that's your number one priority. The number one priority of the RAF was we've got to sort out the pilot training problem, because the problem in the RAF is not lack of cockpits, it's a sort of bubble of 250 pilots not completing training. Because if we can fit that, I can have more aircraft, we can do more things with our aircraft, all that sort of stuff. So 2 of the chiefs got that as a number one priority. That is a fact, that is my direction to them, that's what they'll be judged on. And I'm absolutely clear that 82,000 is our target. We are starting to turn that round. And I hear what you say about the capital budget. I have absolutely looked at that. Everyone would like to look at it. You cannot visit the sins of the father on the son. I mean, I go back to 2010 terms, but Capita and the army have lent into trying to fix this. The early results in the last year have been good. 88% within the year, not December ending year, but the financial year, of our recruitment target. 9,307, I think, is in the pipeline at the moment. I think we need 9,480 or something to be 100%. So that is on track. We need to make sure that we stem the outflow. And something I've already done, which is I didn't know about, but I kept asking the questions, having left the army myself in my 20s, is why do people leave and when do they leave? And what we found is that in the teeth arms, so within the army, what we find within the cavalry, the engineers, and the infantry is they nearly all leave, huge amounts leave at year 4 and 5. If you can get them past year 4 and 5, you go into the green. So actually having some intelligence about how you deal with the areas of outflow and actually asking, even at sub-unit level, I asked recently for sub-unit level, how much of this is about leadership and how much you, as a commanding officer, engage in looking after your men and women, and how much of that is about activity, and also looking at why people are leaving. And there are 2 areas of why people are leaving. One is competing attraction in the civil world. You know, if you're a REMI soldier, you're incredibly attractive to the outside world, high salaries as alternative, but also the change in where you live your lives is different from when I served, and lots of people are leaving because of childcare and issues like that, hence the reason the childcare policy. But also to look at other areas, and some of the reasons for people at the 4-year point is actually about not feeling that their sense of adventure is being met. You know, that their top 3 reasons were things like basically boredom, my challenges aren't being met, what I want to do, my sense of adventure, the adventure is going, and areas around, you know, doing their jobs. And I think those are areas that we also need to look at. So I can't promise you, I can't guarantee, and I think anyone who did would be misleading, but it is my ambition to get back up to that area, or get to 82,000, as is the commitment. Yes, well, I think that's why the veterans piece is important. That esteem, valuing people after their service, veteran rail cards. I mean, I had an interesting discussion with the government about the veterans rail card. I said, I don't think you understand. There are lots of other rail cards, but lots of veterans will wish to switch from another rail card they may have held because they want to say they're a veteran, because it's quite important to veterans to be part of that process.
Okay, microphone here. I think I'll start taking questions 2 at a time because we're getting, got 15 minutes left. Can I have the microphone here, please?
Thank you. Dominic Nichols from the Telegraph. Secretary of State, your party announced on, or coincidentally on Armistice Day, to make legal changes to the Human Rights Act to stop, to give greater legal protection to former service personnel. But by the time of the manifesto, there was a reference to ending vexatious claims, which I don't think anybody would disagree with. So was it a firm pledge, or what happened in between to take it out of the manifesto?
No, it's a firm pledge. It's a firm pledge. It was briefed out in advance of the manifesto, and some of it has already been openly consulted on out of UK, out of ECHR jurisdiction. If you remember, the MOD finished its consultation in October about derogating from the Human Rights Act. It went on operations in areas around Afghanistan and Iraq. It was dealing with that. And then in Northern Ireland, the vexatious claims issues are, at the moment, what you're finding is people already having been inquests, already been through trials, are sometimes being re-taken to task, using the European Convention on Human Rights, saying, oh, well, we need to reinvestigate the investigation, and that's all those inquests are, and actually saying, look, if they've been through an inquest already, actually amending the Human Rights Act so that people who want to take issue with that have to go direct to the Court of Human Rights rather than use our system again and again and again. So that it is a firm commitment, and we'll continue to do that.
Dave Willits from The Sun. You mentioned your priorities for the Army and the RAF. I was just interested to see what your priority was for the Royal Navy, and I wondered whether, the question, Phil, is if they were successfully came into office, what your priorities would be for the 3 services coming straight in.
The Royal Navy was, first of all, the carrier group, complete that, get it ready, but also get what you've got working. It's really, really important. You know, we have historical issues with the Type 45s and the Astutes, and it's, you know, these are directions that I gave to the service chiefs because they were deeply important to the credibility of the MOD when making the case to the Treasury for wanting more money. If I go to the MOD and say, can I have some more money for more Type 31s or more Type 26s, you know, the Treasury bureaucrat will say, well, hang on, we bought you all these ships and half of them aren't working or 10% of them aren't working before you do that. So it's really, really important for our credibility and our service credibility to deliver operational availability on what they've already got. I think that's really important messaging. Some of that is not an easy fix, and we are here to help in the centre, as we'd say, but that is an important priority.
Nia.
So all three services, yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, absolutely for the Army, recruitment and retention, and particularly, you think of our Armed Forces pledges, we are very much committed to decent pay, decent housing, allowing them to have a federation like the Police Federation so that they can voice the concerns, so we have that information coming back that Ben has just alluded to as to why people do leave. They can get their children into schools mid-year, wherever they're posted to, and of course we've also said that we would look at the outsourced contracts. So we do have that absolute firm commitment, so I can assure you that the priority on the Army would have been the same as Ben has outlined. In terms of the RAF, yes, we have also raised at Defence Questions the whole issue of the training of the pilots, and so we're also on record as seeing that as a major priority for our Air Force. And in terms of the Navy, we absolutely must have the staffing that we need for the carriers, and the staffing means both recruiting the right people but also training people to the roles that they are now expected to take, and that is absolutely vital. You cannot have the equipment without having the personnel who are in a position to be able to take over those roles, and we do have a real crisis at the moment in terms of staffing of those carriers.
Thank you. So I suppose we're probably all going to be saying similar things in terms of recruitment and retention. In terms of current servicemen and women, getting the accommodation offer right, making sure that accommodation is fit for purpose and gives people what they need is hugely important. And strengthening the Armed Forces Covenant, particularly at a local level. We, in terms of veterans, were concerned about mental health provision, and that would be true of servicemen and women, but also veterans' mental health. And one other issue is a visa waiver or a fee waiver for foreign and Commonwealth veterans who have served with honour and they're not able to come here. They would be entitled to, but the cost of indefinite leave to remain, the fee, is £2,389. And that is for an individual's former serviceman or woman trying to bring their families over as well, becomes unaffordable. So that would be a very specific offer we would want to make.
Thank you. Could I give the microphone to the man here at the back, and then final question to the man here in the pink shirt.
Josh Arnold Forster, a member of the Institute. In 2006, Mr. Johnson suggested Iran should acquire nuclear weapons. In 2015, he suggested we should form an alliance with Vladimir Putin in Syria to attack Daesh. Earlier this year, he called China one of our best friends. Upon coming into Number 10, he appointed a chief of staff who spent 3 unexplained years in Russia. And finally, he is sitting on an ISC report on Russian interference in UK politics. He's read it, he won't let us read it. Given this background, why should we trust him?
I'll just take the second question quickly.
Peter Price, former member of the European Parliament. The statements and even more the actions of Donald Trump has caused the European Union to make major advances in security field. It's been led currently by a British commissioner until this weekend. In the kind of detail of what's going on, you have dealing with cybercrime, which lends itself often to links with European legislation. You've got all the field of interoperability and procurement. All of those things are work in progress. They're going forward. How should Britain react now? Should we, if we are outside the European Union, be seeking to copy what they're doing, to replicate it, to enable participation in that way, or to join from the outside, or how should we react?
Thank you. Well, I'll ask you if you could keep your questions brief so we don't run over, but how can Boris Johnson be trusted, and how should the UK interact with the EU on defence? Ben?
Well, look, I chaired the all-party Iran group for 8 years in Parliament. In fact, the last time I went to Iran, I went with Jeremy Corbyn and Jack Straw, which was like a clip from The Breakfast Club, if you've ever been in that film. The reality is that when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, he supported the JCPOA agreement. It's what we continue to support. I think all parties support that as a way through, and that's actually about making sure Iran doesn't get a nuclear weapon. So I think, I mean, you use a quote, I've never heard of that quote, but if it exists, I think his position is current, that it is very clear, and his actions as Foreign Secretary was to continue in a process that denied Iran a nuclear weapon. On that, and what was the other, sorry, on the European thing. Look, first of all, some things we will always continue to work together. So cybercrime knows no boundaries. Hybrid knows no boundaries. And of course, through our intelligence relationships, not part of the EU pillars at all, they will remain. We will talk to our friends around the world, whether it's Five Eyes or European allies, on intelligence matters, uninterrupted with Brexit, right? There's no sort of hidden agenda where suddenly the French DGSI will shut us out or anything else. That will continue as a relationship because security, and all the professionals in Europe recognise security is a partnership, it's not a competition. Right? When it comes to defence in Europe, there are things that I would sort of reflect on in my time over the years, both when I was at Kinetic, but also when I was in the armed forces, is for all the talk of European defence, Europe has spectacularly failed to deliver anything other than concepts around directives on European defence procurement, a European Defence Agency concept, but actually, in actual deployments, it always boils down, to the nations of the willing. And some of those nations are European, some of them are not, and that's why if you look at the last X number of years, decades, we've either done NATO, UN, ad hoc, bilateral operations, and I do not believe, and I know Veterans for Britain have done a number of events, including an event here alleging that the withdrawal agreements commits Britain to a one-way ticket to a European army. That is all bunkum, and I don't actually believe that even with Britain out of the EU, the rest of the EU will produce a European army. What I do know is we will continue to work with our friends and allies through NATO, through ad hoc arrangements, and on case by case, where the UK can unilaterally withdraw if it decides to and voluntarily enter an arrangement on anything, whether that's a European defence procurement project, whether that is a European deployment like Bosnia-Herzegovina, areas like that. But as long as it's case by case and we can withdraw, then of course we should never, ever turn down the opportunity of working internationally to solve threats to this country and to our allies. And in or out of the European Union, the security of Europe is very important to the security of Britain.
Thank you, Nia.
Well, first of all, can I just say, Ben has just said not been shut out of any programmes. Well, actually, under the Tories' watch, we have been shut out of the Galileo programme. This is a major, major issue, a major crisis, and any Brexit agreement absolutely must guarantee that we have the best possible security relationship with the rest of the EU, because it's the only sensible way forward. So it is, I believe, a really important factor that any negotiation should make sure that we do try as much as possible to keep in with all of the security programs. And of course, ideally, if we were not leaving the EU, that would be far easier. In terms of the issue of Mr. Johnson, well, I do think he should publish the report. I do think that's extraordinarily stupid of him not to publish the report about the Russian influence on our elections when clearly the Intelligence and Security Committee has said it's fit for publication. And it does worry me. It does worry me very, very much indeed that careless comments have ended up with Mrs. Zaghari Ratcliffe in Iran in a far worse position than she would have been had it not been for the intervention of the current Prime Minister when he was Foreign Secretary. So I am very concerned. And lastly, it was actually a Conservative Secretary of State who was sacked from the National Security Committee for a leak on defence. So I'm not taking any lessons from the Tories. Thank you.
Julie.
Thank you. Well, I think the question was, how can we trust Boris Johnson? And the straightforward answer from me and the Liberal Democrats is, we don't trust Boris Johnson on security, defence of the realm, and other aspects. And linking to the other question, I note we've all been very good about not spouting our party straplines. But Ben has got, now on his knee, it was on the table, the Conservative Party Manifesto. And on the front it says, "Get Brexit done." I think that's the right phrasing.
That's right, look, there you are.
Now, this, I think, highlights why it's quite difficult to trust Mr. Johnson, because getting Brexit done is a myth. We're not going to get Brexit done by the 31st of January, whoever is elected, because there will be so many negotiations going beyond the actual decision of the withdrawal agreement. And one of the key aspects is going to be our security and defence relationship with the European Union. And one of the very few documents that Theresa May published that I thought was really worth looking at was the previous government's proposals on the future security and defence relationship, assuming we left the European Union. And that was suggesting we need to be as close as possible to the European Union. It actually seemed to be taking us to closer cooperation with the EU27 on foreign and security policy than we have been as a member state of the European Union. And I would be saying that is an area where we need to work very closely to ensure that our security interests are met fully. And it might mean that we are subject to certain rules of the European Union, but if that's in our mutual interest and we do it as a sovereign nation state, hopefully everyone in the interests of the nation state and our national security will think that's the right thing to do.
I'm afraid that's all we have time for, but I hope you'll agree with me that's been a fascinating panel. So please will you join with me in thanking our panel members.
I've got the Lib Dem one here, look.